Austin 911, do you need police, fire, or
There was an explosion.
Something exploded or something? There's blood everywhere. We need an ambulance immediately.
We had multiple bombs. This is just unprecedented. We'd never seen this before in Austin.
It just didn't make any sense to hear that he lost his life.
The cry, the scream, like it was something I'll never forget.
We were hopeful with the cameras that we would be able to identify this person before anybody else was killed.
This guy knows what he's doing.
It's a tripwire.
We have a serial bomber. We saw that explosion go off. Oh my God, how many police did we just lose?
Got a big day of school today. Do all your homework.
39-year-old project manager Anthony House is getting his daughter ready for school.
Anthony is my brother, not biological. His mother took me in as another family member. His name was Anthony, but all the friends and family call him Stephen. When I was in a foster home and I used to get ridiculed for having like hand-me-down clothes or cheap clothes, Stephen would give me his newer clothes so I wouldn't get ridiculed, and he helped me with my school, he helped me with my class. Stephen was really good at everything. He was really good in academics, always had A's. All the girls liked him.
Mom should be down soon. Still gotta brush your teeth.
When Stephen's daughter was born, he became extremely family-oriented, extremely protective, and everything that he did was for his family. His daughter was number one in everything. Typical morning for Stephen.
Have a great day at school.
His wife, get up, go to work,
All right, bye. I'll see you later.
and he gets the baby up, takes her to school.
Good.
Thanks.
See you later.
Austin 911, do you need police, fire, or
There
ambulance?
was an explosion.
Okay, tell me exactly what happened.
We don't know. We heard an explosion and my neighbors were outside on the ground.
911, do you need
Hey,
fire?
I don't know what's going on. My neighbor, something exploded or something. There's blood everywhere. We need an ambulance immediately.
The calls were placed by neighbors who had heard the explosion but didn't know how it had occurred. So, as you can imagine, it was pretty frantic. When officers arrived on scene, that's when they discovered that Anthony House was laid out on the front porch. Obviously, he has sustained traumatic injuries. He had shrapnel injuries, not only to his torso, but also to his hand and to his foot. Anthony House was transported to the hospital. So they're trying to put these pieces together to determine, is it a car that had backfired? Is it a electrical outlet or something that had exploded? When I arrived on scene, we could see the devastation that had been created by this pretty significant explosion.
Can you tell me what happened?
Not only had Anthony Stephen House sustained this blast injuries on the front step, but his daughter was inside the residence when this had occurred.
His daughter was at a safe distance and has escaped injury.
Did she see anything?
Talking to the neighbors,
Hi. Can you tell me what you saw?
we were able to establish, in fact, that one of them had saw a package that was on the doorstep of Anthony Stephan House's residence. You can see that there was blood all over the stoop, as well as shrapnel. There were sheet metal screws, nails, there were batteries, as well as twisted pieces from galvanized pipe. So this was a man-made explosion and was intentional. We located small shreds from the cardboard box in which the pipe bomb had been placed. So the package was the origin of the bomb blast. Something like this is just unprecedented. We'd never seen this before in Austin. We didn't have a lot of experience dealing with bomb explosions. This is the only homicide that I'd ever had that involves an actual bomb. We're going into this blind, trying to now put these pieces together to determine why did this happen? Why was Anthony House selected? And why was this bomb placed on his doorstep?
Doctors are unable to save Anthony House. He dies within an hour of the blast.
His wife and mom were at the hospital. His daughter was with them. She was safe. They knew that something has happened to Stephan, but no one would tell him what.
There are a wide range of emotions that go through making a death notification to inform them that their loved one had passed.
When they said he passed, they were destroyed and devastated. It just didn't make any sense. To hear that he lost his life, it was shocking, it was appalling, and it was painful, but the only thing I could think of was his daughter. I couldn't even get past how she may feel because I knew that their relationship was one. They were one. That was his best friend. And I knew that now she would not have him.
Detectives did talk to them to determine if there was anyone out there that potentially wanted to cause him harm or had ill intent. But we were not able to establish any lead that would suggest that somebody intended to cause him harm. We're going to do everything within our power to try to determine who was responsible for this and bring them to justice. Early on, we did look at surveillance video footage from neighbors who lived on that street. You know, doorbell cameras or cameras that were, posted above somebody's garage that potentially could have captured an individual or a vehicle as they passed through that neighborhood within that time frame.
Show me what you've got. Fast forward.
We're going through the surveillance video footage and trying to determine if there's anybody that appeared to be out of place.
Is there any other footage? Play that bit again. Zoom in. Who's that?
There were a number of individuals walking through the neighborhood. But the individuals that we identified on the surveillance video footage were persons that lived in an actual neighborhood.
Investigators talked to residents seen on the surveillance footage.
We'd go door to door, basically gumshoeing it, determine if anybody was deemed to be suspicious.
We're investigating a homicide?
But the individuals that we identified had a valid reason for being there.
Okay.
So it ended up being a dead end.
Investigators turned to the evidence left at the crime scene.
The ATF were brought in to look at the actual bomb-making materials to determine where these components have been purchased from and when. We were hopeful that there were going to be cameras at the stores that may have captured the individual, and we would be able to identify the person responsible.
Tracing the components is their only lead, and is a slow process.
Oh, I need a EMS, please.
Okay, tell me what happened.
Something exploded in the house, and my husband is bleeding everywhere.
A second explosion has rocked Austin, Texas.
An explosion had taken place on Old Fort Hill Drive. We didn't know at that particular time if it was going to be connected to the other bombing or not, because we had a period of 10 days that had passed in between the two.
So what can you tell me?
17-year-old Draylen Mason had picked up a package that was located on the front porch of his residence and had carried it inside to the dining room table where his mother was at and proceeded to open it up. And when they did, that's when that bomb exploded. It was a pretty significant explosion. It ended up killing Draylen Mason there at that residence.
Draylen's mother, Shamika, is rushed to the hospital.
We were able to determine that there were similarities between the two bombs. The nails, the sheet metal screws, as well as clothespins, mouse traps, and type of batteries that were used.
Law enforcement need to trace components of both bombs to stores with surveillance cameras.
They were bombs placed inside of cardboard boxes, so we knew definitively there was going to be a link between them. We had two victims, both African-American males, so we're wondering now is potentially a hate crime. That's where we looked at bringing in the FBI.
Draylen Mason's mom, Shamika, comes out of surgery.
We were able to go see my godmother in the hospital room. My Aunt Shawn, my godmother's older sister, she told her that Draylen didn't make it. And then just the cry, the scream, like it was something I'll never forget. I felt heavy. I felt my heart drop. I felt my stomach just drop.
It was just too much. It was too much for a long time. I said, God got some explaining to do, because I don't understand. I was like, Draylen never hurt anybody. He just wasn't a mean kid. He didn't know how to be.
Draylen was a unique young man, very talented. When he had an instrument in his hand, he was in his element. He was in the zone. He loved it. There's no other feeling except that, like, we were robbed. We lost a star, in my opinion.
While investigators gather surveillance video from the neighborhood, police receive another call.
Do you need police, fire, or EMS?
I heard an explosion. I don't know what happened.
Merely hours later, we received notice of a third bombing at 11:50 a.m., and that occurred on Galindo Street.
The fire and EMS got there very quickly. It's another outside explosion, which means we have a crime scene of hundreds of feet.
When I arrived, obviously there was quite a bit of devastation. It occurred in the roadway, and we had debris up and down the street for several hundred yards. Esperanza Herrera had actually picked up a package that was addressed to a residence across the street. And when she picked this up again, the detonation went off. She sustained significant shrapnel injuries to her left leg in this blast. I took a spray paint can, and every time I came across a piece of potential debris, I ended up spraying a circle around it. We came across pieces of the cardboard box in which the pipe bomb had been placed. We also located nails, sheet metal screws, and we also came across AC Delco AA batteries.
We were very, very confident that all three of these devices were actually made by the same bomber. We have a serial bomber.
We looked at surveillance cameras that were in the vicinity, particularly interested in any video footage that would have captured people walking through the neighborhood or driving through the neighborhood before or after. We were hopeful with cameras that we would be able to identify the person that was responsible or the vehicle that they had traveled in. So on March 18th of 2018, at about 6:50 p.m., there's a 911 call that came in. Two Caucasian males in their early 20s been riding bicycles up near a neighborhood park, and an explosion had taken place.
5506 EOD. We have a confirmed shrapnel.
They were very significantly injured, and thank goodness the fire department and EMS were there very quickly and were able to get them to the hospital and save their lives.
The initial officers arrived on scene, recognized this monofilament line across the sidewalk.
It's a tripwire.
The bomb was placed behind a sign that said, "Drive like your kids live here." What concerned us there was the complexity that now we're into tripwires, the complete randomness. Didn't make a difference who was walking down that street. That was a white neighborhood, so it kind of throws the hate crime piece out of that as well. Obviously, we're concerned because every day now, every other day, there's a bomb going off. But now we have another piece to start looking at. Where would you get that sign? Where would you buy something like that?
We were looking for any video footage of the individual purchasing the sign.
But that is a very long process. Unfortunately, it takes longer than anybody really wants.
A couple days after that, on the early morning hours of March 20th, we received notification from the FedEx shipping facility south of Austin, just north of San Antonio, that a bomb had exploded.
We had an explosion in one of their warehouses and part of their production line there.
Thankfully, there was nobody in the vicinity at the time, so no one was actually injured. But we immediately shut that facility down.
The best part was that FedEx was able to say to us, we can track that package to where it was mailed.
This package that exploded had actually originated from a FedEx shipping facility on Brody Lane in South Austin. And it was crucial then that we go to that facility to see if there's potential for surveillance video footage that may have captured the individual who mailed this package. When we arrived, we were able to establish that the facility had an interior camera, and we're hoping that we're going to capture him on film and be able to definitively say this is the person that was responsible for delivering the bombs.
Show me what you got.
We knew that was going to be a treasure trove of evidence.
So let's see the camera above the door from just before the package was scanned.
They view images captured by the CCTV.
Who's that? Is that him?
So in watching the surveillance video footage, I'm able to see this individual as he actually comes in through the door. We see he's got a hat on. He's got what appears to be long blonde hair.
Right, punch in there.
He's wearing a shirt that's got a graphic on it. He's also wearing gloves that have pink rubber tips on the gloves themselves. Obviously, he's not wanting to leave any identifiable fingerprints or DNA behind.
He was wearing gloves, but we could tell it's a white male. How tall he is, the build he had. There was great excitement because we knew that's the guy. And we knew we have something to go on.
What else have we got?
He walks from that doorway up to the counter and proceeds to mail those packages.
Okay, zoom in.
The poor FedEx person that received the packages is flipping them over, reading barcodes. It's chilling to think of what could have happened right then and there. What if that bomb had gone off at the FedEx store?
Oh, God. There's another package.
I noticed that he mailed 2 packages from that location. One that exploded, and we still needed to track the other package.
Can you find out where that package is?
It was an awful sinking feeling to know that they could end up anywhere, the United States. I had no idea who the intended targets were or how long these packages were going to be in transit and who else was in harm's way. We needed to find the other package.
FedEx raced to track down the parcel, while investigators attempt to identify the suspect.
So that initial video gets us to interview the FedEx employee.
It was important to speak to the clerk because he actually had face-to-face contact with the Austin serial bomber. Up to this point in time, we didn't have that.
We were wondering what you could tell us about this man.
He was able to provide me with detailed head-to-toe description of this male, and he indicated that the long blonde hair was actually a wig. Obviously, went to extremes to alter his appearance.
Do you remember anything else?
The FedEx employee then says to us that the subject, he smelled funny. He smelled like chemicals.
Did you happen to notice the vehicle he drove in?
The employee says, well, he was so strange that after he left, I went to the door and looked, and I could see that he parked a couple of stores down.
The individual parked his red Ford Ranger pickup truck in an adjacent parking lot close to the Party City. He watched him drive off in that vehicle.
Agent Combs' team acquired the Party City video footage to find out if they have caught the suspect's car on camera.
Open up the footage from the parking lot. Let's go back to 10 minutes before the package was delivered. That's it. Rewind.
We could see that it's a red pickup truck with an open bed.
Can you punch that in?
A lot of these businesses will lower the quality of the video footage so that they can store much more footage over time. Unfortunately, we were not able to see a license plate.
Looks like a Ford Ranger.
But now we have something really tangible to go on. You know, we know he's in a red truck. Let's start investigating the truck. We went to the state police and asked them for the registration of every person within 100 miles of Austin that owned that type of truck. So now we have a list. Now we have names.
Go through those vehicles, cross-reference with everything we have so far.
In Texas, there are hundreds of people who own a red truck within the Austin 100-mile radius. It takes time. It's not fast. You have to be studious. You have to pay attention to detail, and you can start working that list down.
Combs, it's FedEx. Did you find it?
FedEx was able to tell us that they had found the second package that the subject had mailed.
In fact, they were able to tell us that the other package was actually in the process of being loaded onto a truck at a FedEx facility just outside of Austin Bergstrom International Airport.
Everyone needs to get out. Lock that place down now.
Time was absolutely of the essence. We absolutely needed to lock it down because potentially there was another bomb that was being loaded onto that truck. It was putting other people in harm's way.
Did you get it in time?
They had isolated it so nobody could get hurt. So we knew that the package was safe. It was in a warehouse, and we would be the first people to actually touch that package.
We had individuals from FBI and ATF go there with a portable X-ray scanner where they were able to scan the package and confirm that there was an undetonated pipe bomb inside that package.
To have an explosive device built and not exploded really can give you a bonanza of evidence.
It's now been 2 weeks since the bomb struck Draylen's home.
It's unnatural for a child to go before a parent. I was struggling, dealing with the devastation. Everybody sees Draylen as this phenomenal, person that they see him as this musician and he's just all these things. He applied to Oberlin Music Conservatory. His bass teacher helped him for that audition. Two weeks after he died, he was accepted into Oberlin. They only take 170 students, and he got the spot. The one thing he was waiting for, he never knew he got it. It just tore me up.
Law enforcement pieced together clues from all of the bombings.
Through the course of the investigation, we were looking for any components that were unique. So in researching the gloves that he was observed wearing in the FedEx facility on Brody Lane, we were able to determine that those gloves can only be purchased from Home Depot. And the sign that he had used, where it says, "Drive like your children live here," we were able to get the universal product code on the back side of that sign and establish that it could also only be purchased from a Home Depot. Now, there are a number of Home Depots in the Austin area and just outside of Austin, but we're able to go to each one of those locations and say, when was this sign last purchased? And in fact, it had been purchased from a Home Depot in Round Rock, just north of Austin. We were able to determine that this sign had been purchased in conjunction with the gloves that we saw him wearing.
This is the only instance of that sign and those gloves being bought in one single purchase.
We were closing in on the suspect, and we knew that it was just a matter of time before we were able to identify and capture him.
Investigators request the surveillance footage from the time of the purchase.
When those videos came in from the Home Depot store, it was exciting. It was exciting to see that we're finally on to something.
Let's go to the camera with the register. Play it. There it is.
Immediately, I can see him walking out of the aisle, and he's got the full sign in his hand. It says, "Drive like your children live here."
Punch in there. Damn, can't make him out.
It's not a great picture of his face, but you can see him checking out with the sign.
Play that part again.
You could tell his height. You could tell his weight. You could tell the way he walked.
Can you bring up the image from FedEx?
You could tell from the video that definitely the guy at Home Depot is the same guy at FedEx. It's somewhat chilling because you know you have a mass murderer, you have a bomber. He's walking around Home Depot buying pieces right next to normal people who have no idea who they're standing next to.
So he's exited, so go to the exterior camera. There he is.
We were able to track this individual after he had purchased his sign and made his way out to the parking lot.
Where's he gone? Wait, is that the same truck?
He actually got into a red pickup truck with an open bed.
Bring up the truck from FedEx.
That same pickup truck is the pickup truck that we observed the individual getting into at Party City right after he'd mailed the packages from the FedEx on Brody Lane.
Can you punch in on the plate?
Although it's great getting video, it's never as good as you want it to be. So you would assume between all these cameras, you'd get a license plate. We had no license plate.
Yeah? They traced the battery packs.
We were able to determine that these battery packs are something specific to Fry's Electronics, that they're sold by the dozens.
One of the FBI analysts was going through receipts of people that bought batteries, would take those receipts, run it against who owns red trucks, and then pull up their driver's license. And by luck, within about 8 names of hundreds we had, the analyst pulls up the driver's license, sees he has a red truck.
The detectives checked the receipt for the date, time, and Fry's store the batteries were bought from.
And we obtained surveillance video footage that was captured from the Fry's Electronics store.
Play it. That's him.
They had an interior camera which captured this individual when he actually exited the store.
Pause it there.
It was a great picture of his face. The analyst pulls up the driver's license photo, compares that to the video we had.
Got him.
And then that's the first time we knew we had a name. We had who the bomber was.
When this individual made the purchase of the battery packs from the Fry's Electronics, he used a credit card. And that credit card was in the name of Mark Anthony Condit.
So once we have him identified, we sent surveillance teams to his house. We saw the red truck at the house.
We put a game plan together where we were actually going to execute a search and arrest warrant at the residence. But we were fearful that the residence potentially could be booby-trapped.
The order was given, if he leaves that house, you're gonna take him down because he could be leaving to mail a device. But we didn't know if he was in that house or not.
There's no sign of any movement inside the residence.
So we continued to look at other avenues as well. Where is he? Where could he possibly be?
We were trying to establish his potential whereabouts. And one of the things that we would typically do is track his cell phone. But we were not able to come across any activity from his phone. I mean, it was silent at that point in time, so we really did not know where he was at. But then I received notification that he had activated his phone and was live. Agents were able to track his phone to a parking lot of a hotel in the Round Rock area.
And the decision was made that the Austin SWAT team would be the tactical team that would take him down.
We actually had 2 fixed-wing planes that were in the area circling, watching his vehicle.
Mark Condit is inside a parked SUV.
We were concerned that his truck was going to be booby-trapped.
Air to ground, he's on the move, backing out now.
He started moving. He backed out of the parking space and began moving towards the interstate. The SWAT team followed him.
I got him eastbound. Gonna be taking a right turn southbound.
When his car left the parking lot and started to go down the access road to the highway, the order was
take him down before he hits that highway.
Because the chances of losing him or hurting other people are just too high.
We're 35 frontage and Old Settlers, and he's red balled. He's stopped right now. All right, we're through the intersection, southbound, still on frontage.
As he's making his way towards the interstate, the SWAT commander came over the radio.
Yeah, roger that, upstream.
And directed a vehicle assault. The 2 SWAT vehicles separated. One got in front of his truck, the other one behind him, and essentially boxed him in. The SWAT truck following was able to ram him into a little culvert between the frontage road and the interstate.
All right, Vans made contact with him.
SWAT members bailed out of the vehicle, ran up to the truck on the passenger side.
Got an explosion inside the vehicle.
I hear them say detonation, and then the radio was just eerily silent.
Tango 19er, come in.
Once he realized that he was being arrested, he detonated an explosive device in the car. When we saw that explosion go off, I think all of us felt, oh my God, how many police did we just lose? By the grace of God, very few injuries, very minor injuries. And they came on the radio and told us, subject is dead. We're pulling back, because they didn't know if there were any more devices in that car. So once the bomber kills himself, we execute a search warrant at his house.
We'd actually entered through the bedroom window into his room, rather than going through the door, because we thought potentially it could be booby traps. We could see that there were a number of electronic devices, batteries, cellular telephones, wires.
There's the wig.
As well as disguises. He had a glow vest and a hard hat. Potentially he had worn that when he was in one of these neighborhoods, so he was able to move freely in and out. We also located a significant amount of ammonium nitride. There was no question that he had significant plans to kill or injure additional people.
And we also found a confession video that he had made literally moments before the SWAT team had stopped him. It's dark, so you actually don't see the video, but you can hear the audio very clearly, in which he goes through each bombing to date, and he discusses why he did them. There was some controversy as far as releasing publicly the confession video that the bomber made. Our concern was, if that video was released, it lived forever on the internet. It could certainly inspire other people, and we certainly don't want to give a voice to murderers. What was really chilling about this video is that he's just so matter-of-fact, no emotion, clearly says, I just love killing people. I like doing it. I've thought about it for a while. So the motive was clear. He clearly states that these were random people, and he just liked killing people and building bombs.
When we try to look at any outside influences, trying to determine why he would have committed an act like this, we were able to establish at one point he had watched the Unabomber series. You know, I'm wondering if that potentially had spurred his interest in following in Ted Kaczynski's footsteps, but we just don't know. It was a huge relief in the end when we were able to bring this to a resolution. Without question, video footage made this case for us. You know, we had the surveillance video footage of him buying these components at these different locations, and we were able to compare the name from the credit card to that master list of the Ford Ranger pickup truck registration records. But I feel like he escaped justice in a sense by self-detonating, because we didn't go through the process of having a trial. Those families never got their day in court.
My brother, Stephen, he had my best interest at heart. So I could tell him whatever I was thinking, and he would give me the best advice he could give me that was not self-serving. Not having someone in your corner that loves you, that you can look up to and ask advice of, it's kind of depressing sometimes.
He took away my brother. He took away somebody I loved.
The freezing winter of Detroit in 2010 did not just bring record-breaking snow. It brought a paralyzing terror that gripped the industrial heart of Michigan, leaving behind a ghost story that would haunt the city for nearly 2 decades. On a bitterly cold night in December, amidst the skeletal ruins of the old automotive plants and the howling winds blowing off the Detroit River, a young, ambitious investigative journalist named Marcus Vance vanished without a single trace. He wasn't just any reporter. Marcus was on the verge of exposing a massive, multi-million-dollar corruption ring that tied prominent local politicians to violent street syndicates operating in the shadows of the city's crumbling infrastructure. His car was found idling on an abandoned overpass near the Packard automotive plant, the driver's side door flung wide open, his keys still in the ignition, and his recording equipment completely shattered on the slush-covered asphalt below. For 16 grueling years, this case stood as a monumental, frustrating enigma, a classic cold case that the Detroit Police Department simply could not crack, a dark mystery that slowly faded into the background noise of a city fighting for its own survival. The file grew thick with dead-end leads, uncooperative suspects, and the agonizing, silent passage of time, leaving a family broken and a community deeply shocked by the absolute impunity of the perpetrators. But the gears of justice, though agonizingly slow, possess an unyielding momentum, and the ultimate breakthrough would not come from a traditional police interrogation room or a sudden stroke of forensic luck. Instead, it would be triggered by a viral true crime podcast, an independent digital investigation that relentlessly dragged the forgotten tragedy back into the public consciousness, relentlessly pulling on a loose thread until an entire web of lies unraveled. This rogue broadcast did what a multi-agency task force failed to achieve. It located a crucial, deeply hidden witness who had spent 16 terrifying years running from the ghosts of that fateful December night, a witness whose explosive testimony would shock Detroit high society to its absolute core. The initial disappearance of Marcus Vance sent a massive, instantaneous shockwave through the local press corps and the wider Detroit community, sparking a frantic, high-stakes manhunt that immediately ran into an impenetrable wall of institutional silence and calculated obstruction. Marcus was known for his uncompromising, fearless reporting style, a man who refused to back down when powerful figures threatened his life or his livelihood. In the weeks leading up to his sudden abduction, his personal journals, later recovered by his devastated sister, indicated that he had arranged a late-night meeting with a highly placed, anonymous source codenamed The Architect. This source had promised to deliver ironclad documentary proof of a systematic skimming operation that diverted federal urban development funds directly into the pockets of elite city officials and their criminal enforcers. On the night of December 14, 2010, the temperature plummeted below zero, and a heavy, blinding blizzard blanketed the metro area, creating the perfect, chaotic cover for a ruthless, premeditated ambush. When patrol officers first arrived at the abandoned overpass, the eerie scene looked like a cinematic tableau of a kidnapping in progress. The engine of Marcus's sedan was still humming, the headlights cut through the swirling snow, pointing toward the dark, empty void of the industrial wasteland, but the reporter himself had completely dissolved into the freezing night air. The crime scene itself was a nightmare of lost data and compromised forensics, as the rapidly accumulating snow quickly buried potential footprints, tire tracks, and microscopic evidence before the technicians could properly process the area. Detective Sarah Jenkins, an aggressive, sharp-minded investigator who inherited the file during the initial, chaotic 48 hours, immediately sensed that this was no ordinary missing persons case. The sheer precision of the abduction pointed toward a highly professional, calculated operation. She focused her early efforts on tracking Marcus's final cell phone pings, which led investigators on a confusing, erratic trail through the abandoned warehouses of the East Side before the signal was abruptly, permanently terminated. Every single potential camera angle in the vicinity was either broken, obscured by the heavy snow, or mysteriously wiped clean of data within hours of the incident, suggesting a terrifying level of insider access and coordination. Marcus's apartment was found meticulously ransacked, his personal computer hard drives drilled through, and his notes systematically shredded, leaving the investigative team with almost nothing to reconstruct his final movements or identify the mysterious source he was rushing to meet. As the days blended into agonizing months, The initial media fury began to die down, and the investigation into the Vance disappearance ground to a devastating, frustrating halt, stymied by a total lack of cooperative witnesses and a sudden, suspicious lack of political will to fund the task force. Whispers began to circulate through the corridors of City Hall that Marcus had simply gotten in too deep with the wrong people, that his disappearance was a tragic but inevitable consequence of a reckless lifestyle, a narrative deliberately pushed by the very individuals he was trying to expose. Detective Jenkins found herself constantly reassigned to active, low-profile homicides, her requests for overtime and advanced wiretaps on key suspects systematically denied by her superiors, who claimed resources were needed elsewhere in a cash-strapped city. The case file was officially labeled a cold case, packed away into a cardboard box and stored in the dark basement archives of the police headquarters, a silent monument to a system that had failed one of its most courageous defenders. The community was left with a lingering, bitter sense of dread, a stark reminder that in certain corners of Detroit, the truth was a commodity that could be violently, permanently suppressed if you had enough money and power to enforce the silence. But the digital age has a strange, unpredictable way of resurrecting the dead and breathing new life into forgotten tragedies that society has long since written off as unsolvable. In the spring of 2025, an independent investigative journalist and podcaster named Liam Thorne launched a multi-part audio documentary series titled Shadows of the Motor City, dedicated entirely to re-examining the Marcus Vance disappearance. Thorne did not possess a badge or a gun, but he possessed an obsessive determination, a global audience of millions of highly engaged listeners, and a unique ability to crowdsource information across international borders. He spent months digitalizing old police records, enhancement filtering historical audio clips, and mapping out the social and professional networks of every single politician, developer, and gang leader active in Detroit during the bleak winter of 2010. The podcast quickly became a massive cultural phenomenon, generating tens of thousands of tips, comments, and theories from amateur sleuths worldwide, putting immense, unprecedented public pressure back on the Detroit Police Department to reopen the stagnant investigation. The real breakthrough came during the production of the podcast's 9th episode, when Thorne received a heavily encrypted, untraceable audio file through a secure whistleblower portal containing a voice message that would change the trajectory of the case forever. The caller spoke in a trembling, hushed whisper, their voice heavily distorted by fear, but the details they provided were so intimate, so terrifyingly specific to the crime scene, that Thorne instantly knew he was listening to someone who had been physically present on that abandoned overpass in 2010. The caller did not identify themselves, but they dropped a bombshell piece of information. They claimed that the entire abduction had been witnessed by a third party, a terrified teenager who had been hiding inside an abandoned guard shack nearby, a witness whose existence had been completely missed by the original police response. This hidden witness had spent the last 16 years living under a false identity, paralyzed by the absolute certainty that if the perpetrators ever discovered their existence, they would meet the exact same gruesome fate as Marcus Vance. The revelation of a hidden, unrecorded witness exploded across the true crime community like a bombshell, forcing the newly formed NYPD and Detroit Cold Case Task Force to coordinate a massive, covert operation to verify the podcast's shocking claims. The anonymous caller had provided just enough geographical and chronological data to allow investigators to cross-reference historical housing records, juvenile detention logs, and old neighborhood manifests from the East Side in 2010. The task fell back onto Sarah Jenkins, now a veteran lieutenant who had never truly let go of the Vance file, carrying the guilt of the initial failure like a heavy weight throughout her long, distinguished career. Jenkins realized that if this witness was still alive, they were in imminent, mortal danger. The podcast had effectively alerted the killers that their multi-decade secret was no longer secure. A frantic, secret race began between law enforcement and the dark forces of the Detroit underworld, both sides desperately scrambling to locate a ghost who had spent 16 years masterfully erasing their digital footprint from the face of the earth. Through meticulous, old-school detective work combined with modern data analytics, Jenkins's team began to focus their attention on a 32-year-old construction laborer named David Miller, currently residing in a quiet, rural town in northern Ohio. Miller's genetic and financial profile was a patchwork of inconsistencies. His Social Security number had been issued suspiciously late in life. He had no digital footprint prior to 2011, and he moved locations every 18 months, always paying his rent in cash and avoiding any form of state identification where possible. Jenkins knew that this was her target, a man living a life of perpetual flight, a man constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the day his past would finally catch up with him. A surveillance team was deployed to the quiet Ohio town, watching Miller from a distance as he went about his routine, noting the extreme paranoia that governed his every movement, the way his eyes constantly scanned the perimeter of his workplace, the way he hesitated before opening his front door. The moment of confrontation was planned with extreme care, designed to minimize panic and prevent Miller from running or taking drastic measures to protect his cover. On a rainy Tuesday morning, as Miller stepped out of a local diner carrying a cup of coffee, he was quietly, efficiently surrounded by 4 plainclothes federal agents and Lieutenant Jenkins, who stepped into his path and spoke his true, childhood name aloud for the first time in 16 years. Elena. The reaction was instantaneous and heartbreaking. The coffee cup slipped from his trembling fingers, splashing onto the wet concrete. His face drained of all color, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh of pure, exhausting defeat. He didn't protest, he didn't demand a lawyer, and he didn't ask what this was about. He simply looked at Jenkins with tears welling in his eyes and whispered, "You took too long. I've been waiting in hell for 16 years." Inside the secure interrogation room of a nearby federal building, safely removed from any potential leaks within the local Detroit infrastructure, Elena, who had transitioned and lived as David to further obscure his identity, finally began to unburden his soul. In a continuous, emotional torrent of words, he described the sheer, paralyzing horror of what he had witnessed as a homeless 16-year-old teenager seeking shelter from the 2010 blizzard inside that abandoned Packard plant guard shack. He had been huddled beneath a pile of old blankets, shivering violently, when he heard the screeching tires of Marcus Vance's sedan slam to a halt on the overpass just 20 yards away. Through a cracked, grime-covered window, Elena had watched in absolute, frozen terror as 2 large, masked men in tactical gear forcefully blocked Marcus's car with a dark SUV, smashing the driver's side window and dragging the screaming journalist out into the blinding snow. But the most Chandong, community-shattering detail of Elena's testimony was not the violence of the abduction itself, but the identity of the third man who stood under the flickering amber streetlights, calmly directing the entire operation. Elena described a tall, elegant man in an expensive cashmere coat who stepped out of the back seat of the SUV, a man who casually lit a cigarette as he watched his enforcers beat Marcus into submission. When the journalist desperately screamed out for mercy, calling the man by his actual name, the figure in the cashmere coat calmly leaned down, looked Marcus directly in the eyes, and whispered a final, chilling sentence before ordering his men to throw the reporter into the trunk of the SUV. That man, identified with absolute, unwavering certainty by Elena from historical photographs, was none other than Councilman Thomas Sterling, the charismatic, untouchable political dynasty heir who currently served as one of the state's most powerful, revered public figures. The structural framework of Detroit's political elite began to fracture the moment Elena's formal, videotaped deposition was securely locked into the federal evidence database. Thomas Sterling wasn't just a politician. He was a foundational pillar of the city's modern establishment, a man whose family had controlled real estate, shipping, and local elections for 3 generations. In 2010, he had been a rising councilman championing the New Detroit Initiative. By 2026, he was a senior statesman, a kingmaker whose endorsement could make or break gubernatorial candidates, a philanthropist whose name was carved into the marble walls of libraries and hospitals across Michigan. To accuse a man of his stature of a brutal, cold-blooded murder based on a 16-year-old cold case was a move that required flawless execution and absolute legal invincibility, A single mistake would result in the immediate destruction of the prosecution and the permanent escape of a monster. Lieutenant Jenkins and the federal prosecutors worked in total isolation, bypassing the standard lines of communication within the local police departments to prevent any potential leaks from tipping off Sterling's vast, well-connected intelligence network. They knew that Sterling possessed an army of high-priced defense attorneys, public relations, crisis management firms, and deep ties within the judiciary that could effortlessly suppress a warrant if they saw it coming. For 3 intensive weeks, the task force worked 18-hour days, meticulously verifying every single aspect of Elena's 2010 testimony against the historical, archived data logs of the Packard plant vicinity. They uncovered old cellular tower metadata that placed Sterling's personal, unlisted mobile device in the exact sector of the east side at 2:14 a.m. on the night of the disappearance, a piece of data that had been deliberately omitted from the initial 2010 report by a compromised tech unit technician. The financial trail, long cold and buried beneath layers of corporate restructuring, began to bleed fresh data when federal forensic accountants applied modern blockchain tracing algorithms to Sterling's historical campaign finance accounts. They discovered a massive, irregular cash withdrawal of $50,000 executed just 6 hours after Marcus Vance vanished, a withdrawal masked as an emergency consulting fee paid to a defunct shell company owned by a notorious local enforcer named Iron Mike Kowalski. Kowalski had died in a prison stabbing in 2017, but his old financial ledgers had been preserved in an unrelated racketeering file, holding the final, missing piece of the puzzle, a handwritten confirmation of a contract titled The Reporter Issue, signed with a unique, stylized monogram that belonged exclusively to Thomas Sterling. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was a devastating, interlocking web of forensic science, financial corruption, and eyewitness testimony that pointed directly to a state-sponsored execution. The tactical plan for Sterling's arrest was executed with an aggressive, direct force that signaled to the entire city that the era of political immunity was officially over. On a bright Thursday afternoon, as Sterling stood on the steps of City Hall surrounded by cameras, preparing to announce a massive new harbor redevelopment project, 3 black federal SUVs screeched to a halt at the curb. Before his private security detail could even react, a dozen armed federal agents swarmed the plaza, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun, isolating the powerful politician from his stunned staff. Lieutenant Jenkins stepped forward through the sea of flashing media cameras, her voice echoing off the stone pillars of City Hall as she read Thomas Sterling his rights for the first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit the abduction of Marcus Vance. The expressions of absolute, paralyzed disbelief on the faces of the assembled city officials were captured live on midday television, a Chandong visual that instantly went viral across the globe. As the handcuffs snapped shut around Sterling's wrists, the crowd that had gathered for the press conference erupted into a chaotic mixture of gasps, cheers, and stunned silence. The powerful tycoon, usually so calm, elegant, and completely in control, lost his composure for a split second, his face contorting into a mask of pure, vicious rage as he was forcefully guided into the back of an unmarked vehicle. The media instantly mobilized, their headlines screaming across digital platforms. Detroit 2010 Cold Case Solved. Podcast uncovers crucial hidden witness. The city was forced to confront the dark reality that their grand renaissance had been funded, directed, and built by a man who carried the blood of a courageous journalist on his hands for 16 years, a man who had used his immense public stature as a shield against the ultimate sin. The immediate aftermath of Sterling's dramatic arrest triggered a massive, systemic purge within the administrative and law enforcement institutions of Detroit as the sheer scale of his historical cover-up began to surface. Investigators uncovered an internal, highly classified file within the police archives that proved the initial 2010 investigation had been deliberately, systematically sabotaged from within by high-ranking officials who had received lucrative real estate kickbacks from Sterling's development firms. Several retired captains and former prosecutors suddenly found themselves facing federal grand jury subpoenas, their comfortable retirement shattered by the realization that their complicity in Marcus Vance's murder was finally being dragged into the unyielding light of justice. The public's trust in the local system collapsed entirely, replaced by a fierce, righteous fury that demanded a total, uncompromising accounting of every single cold case file that had been buried during Sterling's multi-decade reign of influence. Inside the federal holding facility, Thomas Sterling's high-priced legal team launched an aggressive, immediate counteroffensive, filing a barrage of motions aimed at disqualifying Elena's testimony and painting the entire prosecution as a politically motivated hit job fueled by podcast gossip. They argued that Elena was an unreliable witness with a history of housing instability and mental health trauma, whose memories had been corrupted by 16 years of isolation and the sensationalized narrative propagated by Shadows of the Motor City. They demanded that their client be released on a signature bond, arguing that an elite public figure of Sterling's immense stature posed absolutely no flight risk and deserved to await trial in his multi-million-dollar mansion in Grosse Pointe. But the federal judge, recognizing the extreme gravity of the charges and the horrifying patterns of intimidation exposed by the financial records, flatly denied bail, ordering Sterling to remain incarcerated in a high-security cell until the commencement of the trial. Meanwhile, Liam Thorne, the podcaster whose independent investigation had broken the decades-old deadlock, found himself at the center of an international media storm, praised as a pioneer of modern digital journalism while simultaneously facing intense, implicit threats from the remnants of Sterling's criminal network. He released a special, live broadcast episode of Shadows of the Motor City, dedicating the moment not to his own success, but to the memory of Marcus Vance and the incredible, survivalist courage of Elena. Thorne revealed that since the arrest, his team had been flooded with hundreds of new tips from former city employees, contractors, and low-level street operators who were suddenly willing to speak out, now that the terrifying shadow of Sterling's immunity had been permanently lifted from the city. The podcast had transformed from a simple true crime retrospective into a living, breathing instrument of social justice, an audio platform that had successfully challenged the most powerful dynasty in Michigan and won. The physical search for Marcus Vance's remains became the next, deeply emotional focal point of the task force's efforts, as Elena's testimony provided specific coordinates that led search teams back to the industrial wasteland where the abduction had occurred. For 16 years, Marcus's body had been hidden in a location so ordinary, so completely integrated into the urban decay of the East Side, that thousands of people had walked past it without ever realizing they were standing on a grave. Utilizing ground-penetrating radar, specialized canine units, and heavy excavation equipment, forensic teams descended upon an old, sealed concrete vault beneath the foundation of a Sterling-owned warehouse near the riverfront. The entire area was cordoned off from the press, the silence of the industrial zone broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thud of jackhammers tearing through layers of reinforced stone that had been poured just days after the 2010 blizzard. On the third day of the intense excavation, deep within the dark, damp recesses of the subterranean vault, the search teams finally located what they were looking for: a heavy, industrial steel drum, completely encased in commercial-grade resin. When the forensic anthropologists carefully breached the structure, they discovered the remarkably preserved remains of Marcus Vance, still clutching a small, digital voice recorder in his skeletal hand, a final, defiant act of journalistic courage from a man who knew he was about to be murdered. The recorder, remarkably shielded from moisture and decay by the resin casing, was rushed directly to a specialized federal cyberforensics lab in Washington, where technicians began the delicate, high-stakes process of extracting the data from the ancient memory chip. The dead man was about to speak from beyond the grave, and his final words would provide the ultimate, absolute validation of the truth that Elena had carried in silence for 16 agonizing years. The successful extraction of the audio data from Marcus Vance's recovered voice recorder provided the prosecution with an ironclad, indisputable piece of evidence that effectively sealed Thomas Sterling's judicial fate before the trial even commenced. The audio file, recorded in the terrifying final moments inside the trunk of the moving SUV on December 14, 2010, captured the raw, ambient sounds of the blizzard outside, the heavy breathing of the captive journalist, and the unmistakable, clear voices of his captors discussing their orders. In a moment of chilling clarity that left the federal grand jury in absolute silence, Sterling's voice could be heard over a speakerphone call, explicitly instructing his enforcers to make sure the body is buried deep under the warehouse foundation before the city crews start clearing the snow in the morning. The arrogance of the powerful politician was laid bare for the world to hear, his own words transforming into the definitive legal instrument that would dismantle his legacy and send him to a maximum security prison for the rest of his life. When the trial finally commenced in the summer of 2026, the defense's elaborate strategies completely collapsed under the sheer, crushing weight of the interlocking forensic and digital evidence presented by the federal prosecutors. Elena took the witness stand with a quiet, fierce composure, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had ordered the execution of Marcus Vance, delivering a flawless, emotionally devastating account of the crime that left the courtroom paralyzed. The high-priced defense attorneys tried to execute a ruthless cross-examination, but Elena's consistency, combined with the matching audio data from the recovered recorder, rendered their attacks completely useless. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, bringing a swift, decisive end to a multi-decade run of criminal immunity. Thomas Sterling was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, his proud family name permanently stripped from every public building, street sign, and university wing in the state of Michigan, a total erasure of a dynasty built on corruption and blood. The corporate assets of Sterling Development were systematically liquidated to fund a massive, independent trust dedicated to supporting investigative journalism and protecting vulnerable whistleblowers across the country. The city of Detroit experienced a profound, cathartic release, a collective realization that the dark shadows of the past could finally be dispelled when ordinary citizens, independent journalists, and relentless science combined their forces to demand accountability. The cold case file of Marcus Vance was officially closed, but its impact would continue to reverberate through the halls of power for generations, a timeless reminder that no amount of wealth or influence can permanently silence the voice of truth. The deep, lingering resonance of the Vance case left an indelible mark on the soul of Detroit, transforming the abandoned overpass near the Packard plant from a symbol of urban decay and violent tragedy into a sacred space of remembrance and public honor. A permanent monument was erected at the site, a simple, striking bronze sculpture of a journalist's notepad and microphone, their surfaces reflecting the shifting light of the city skyline that Marcus had died trying to protect. Every year on December 14th, amidst the falling snow and the howling winter winds, a quiet crowd of citizens, reporters, and young activists gathers at the monument, lighting candles that flicker against the dark void of the industrial wasteland. The ghost of 2010 has finally been laid to rest, but the lesson of his sacrifice remains vibrant and alive, a powerful testament to a city that refused to forget its lost child, and a digital revolution that proved that even the coldest cases can be brought back to life by the unyielding pursuit of justice. The audio file arrived like a lightning bolt contained within a fragile glass bottle, a digital scream sent into the void of Liam Thorne's secure Dropbox that shattered the stillness of his late-night editing suite. For the detectives in the cold case task force, who had spent decades staring at the gray, pixelated remnants of the 2010 investigation, the message was not just evidence, it was an indictment of their own failures. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins sat in the dim, blue light of her office, replaying the distorted, trembling voice of the whistleblower, hearing the unmistakable cadence of someone who had been holding their breath for 16 years. The weight of that recording was physical. It felt as if the air in the room had suddenly thinned, turning into the biting, frozen oxygen of that night in December 2010. They knew immediately that this was not a prank, nor a desperate plea for attention. This was the missing link in a chain of evidence that had been deliberately severed by hands far more powerful than any common street criminal. The discovery of the witness, a person who had been a ghost in the machine, a silent observer of a murder that had defined the decay of the city, sent a ripple of existential dread through the ranks of the precinct. They weren't just hunting a killer, they were hunting the architects of a cover-up that had survived, thrived, and evolved in the shadows of the Motor City's supposed renaissance. The race to find the witness began in the dead of night, a clandestine operation fueled by caffeine, paranoia, and the terrifying knowledge that if they found the witness, someone else, someone with infinite resources and a history of lethal violence, would be looking for them, too. The trail was colder than the frozen river, a labyrinthine path of obfuscated identities and dead-end databases that forced the task force to pivot away from traditional investigative techniques. Jenkins authorized a full-scale digital dragnet, bypassing the standard protocols that usually required weeks of paperwork, knowing that the institutional gatekeepers might flag their activity if they caught wind of the investigation's true scope. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack was the entire state of Michigan, and the needle was a person who had spent over a decade perfecting the art of disappearing while standing in plain sight. Every click of the mouse, every cross-reference of antiquated Social Security records felt like an intrusion into a life that had been built on the foundation of fear. They traced the ghost back through the fractured logic of the 2010 juvenile system, finding a disjointed file of a ward of the state, a teenager who had slipped through the cracks of the system on the very night Marcus Vance vanished. The file was thin, almost insulting in its brevity, listing a name that no longer existed and an address that had long since been bulldozed into the scarred, empty landscape of Detroit's East Side. As the detectives dug deeper, the sheer, crushing reality of what this witness had endured began to manifest in the data. There were no financial records, no credit history, no digital footprint, a total void of existence. It was a life lived in the margins, a survivalist's trajectory dictated by the absolute, uncompromising need to remain unnoticed. The detectives began to map the witness's movements, not through bank statements or phone logs, but through the peripheral markers of a life in hiding, an unclaimed prescription here, a transient tax filing there, a pattern of short-term leases that always ended abruptly and without explanation. The witness was a master of the gray man strategy, blending into the background of 1,000 different days, never staying long enough to form a connection that could be traced back to the night at the Packard plant. Jenkins felt a profound, aching pity for the soul she was hunting, realizing that this person hadn't just witnessed a murder, they had been sentenced to a life of exile by the trauma of it. The witness had seen the apex of Detroit's power structure commit an atrocity, and in doing so, had realized that the law was not a shield, but a threat. The realization that they were the hunter, and yet also the potential savior, transformed the mission from a simple criminal investigation into a moral crusade. While the police scrambled through the archives, the city's underbelly began to stir. The podcast, Shadows of the Motor City, had not just alerted the public, it had rung a dinner bell for the predators who had kept the Marcus Vance file closed for so long. Information in Detroit is a currency, and the sudden, frantic interest in a 16-year-old cold case was a massive inflation of the market. The task force began to pick up signals of interference, unmarked vehicles lingering outside the homes of retired detectives, encrypted burner phones pinging in the vicinity of the cold case unit's headquarters, and the sudden, suspicious destruction of digital files in the county records office. It became blindingly obvious that someone, somewhere, in the high-rises overlooking the Detroit River, was watching the investigators. The hunt had become a pincer movement. The police were rushing toward the witness, but the shadow enforcers were doing the same, armed with the knowledge that the podcast was the only thing preventing them from silencing the secret forever. The pressure was immense, a psychological vice tightening around everyone involved, turning every second into a calculation of risk and reward. The witness, known now only by a string of shifting pseudonyms, was unaware that the walls were closing in. In a small, nondescript apartment in northern Ohio, miles away from the decay of the city that had birthed his trauma, he sat in the dark, listening to the static of a police scanner. He kept perpetually tuned to the frequencies of the surrounding counties. He was a creature of habit, his life a rigid architecture of safety precautions, but the podcast had destabilized the delicate ecosystem of his existence. He had heard his own story told in the voice of a stranger, heard the details he had kept locked in the iron vault of his memory echoed back to him in the sanitized, sensationalized tone of a reporter who had no idea what it felt like to have a gun barrel pressed against your soul. The fear was a physical weight, a constant, low-frequency vibration that lived in his marrow. He knew the time for hiding was ending. The podcast had forced his hand, dragging the ghosts of 2010 into the light of 2026, and he knew, with the cynical clarity of a survivor, that the people he had seen that night would never allow him to live long enough to testify. The breakthrough came not from a computer, but from a discarded photograph found in the deep archives of a defunct social services agency. It was a grainy, low-resolution shot of a group of teenagers taken at a community center in 2010, the kind of throwaway picture that usually holds no value. But when Jenkins's team ran a facial recognition algorithm on every face in the photo, they found a match that had been hidden by the chaotic, manual filing systems of an overwhelmed bureaucracy. The name attached to the face was Elena, a girl who had been reported missing by a foster home 3 days after Marcus Vance died, a report that had been filed, ignored, and eventually shredded. The detectives sat in silence as the truth washed over them. The witness was not just a random bystander. They were a victim of the same system that had swallowed the reporter. The investigation pivoted, the digital dragnet tightening around the identity of Elena, tracing her path from a scared, 16-year-old girl to the shadow woman she had become. They followed the breadcrumbs of her survival, a series of factory jobs, waitressing gigs, and labor positions that required no credentials, all leading toward the Rust Belt corridor. They found her in the town of Findlay, Ohio. It was a place of beige siding and quiet streets, a landscape so aggressively normal that it acted as the perfect camouflage. The surveillance team arrived at 4 a.m., the hour when the world is at its most fragile, and staked out the apartment complex. They didn't see a criminal mastermind or a person of interest. They saw a woman who moved with the fluid, defensive grace of a wild animal, someone who never walked down the center of the sidewalk and always checked the reflections in shop windows. The sight of her was a gut punch to Jenkins, who had spent decades picturing a shadowy, monstrous entity. Instead, she saw the shattered wreckage of a human life, someone who had been forced to kill off their own identity to escape the reach of a monster. The decision to move in was fraught with terror. If they spooked her, she would vanish again, and this time, there would be no finding her. The team knew they had one shot to convince her that the state wasn't there to silence her, but to finally, after 16 years, protect her. The confrontation was executed with the delicacy of a bomb disposal unit. There were no flashing lights, no sirens, no shouting commands. Just a quiet, persistent knock on a door that had been reinforced with extra deadbolts. When she opened it, she was holding a heavy wrench, her knuckles white, her eyes scanning the hallway for an escape route that didn't exist. Jenkins stood alone in the hallway, her hands visible, her badge tucked away. She didn't talk about evidence or the law. She talked about Marcus. She spoke the name like an incantation, watching for the reaction that would confirm everything. The witness's face didn't register surprise. It registered a profound, exhausted resignation, as if she had been waiting for this exact knock for half of her life. She lowered the wrench, the metal clattering against the floorboards, and the silence in the hallway stretched out, heavy and absolute, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. She wasn't David, or Elena, or any of the other names she had stolen for herself. She was a survivor, and she had finally reached the end of her endurance. As they ushered her into the unmarked vehicle, the city of Detroit felt a million miles away, but the reach of the conspiracy was immediate. Within hours of the extraction, the task force began receiving strange, untraceable calls, not threats, but offers. Offers of money, offers of immunity, offers of problems being made to go away if they simply turned the car around and drove away. It was the first hard proof that the machinery of the Sterling dynasty was active, alert, and terrifyingly efficient. They weren't dealing with a past crime anymore. They were dealing with a live, ongoing operation to pervert the course of justice. The drive back to Michigan was a gauntlet of tension. Every vehicle that paced them on the highway was scrutinized. Every turnoff was a potential ambush point. The witness sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the blurred, passing landscape, her demeanor entirely detached. She was a woman who had already died once, 16 years ago, and she was watching the world move on without her. The safe house they took her to was a fortress, a hidden, windowless facility deep in the Michigan countryside, guarded by federal agents who had been vetted for their lack of ties to the Detroit political machine. The interrogation was not a questioning session. It was a deposition of ghosts. As the recorder spun, she spoke. She didn't start with the murder. She started with the cold. She described the Packard plant, the smell of rot and old oil, the way the wind rattled the metal siding like a trapped animal. She spoke of the night, the darkness that felt thick enough to touch, and the sudden, jarring intrusion of human voices in a place where only rats and junkies should have been. She described the car, the man, and the feeling of being hunted in a space that was supposed to be a sanctuary. The details were so vivid, so visceral, that the stenographer's hands shook as she typed. It wasn't just a testimony. It was a haunting. She laid out the scene piece by piece, the utter, blinding brutality of it. For Jenkins, listening to the account was an out-of-body experience. She had read the 2010 file until the pages were translucent, but the words on the paper were cold, clinical, and lifeless compared to this. The witness explained the hierarchy of the killers, the way they moved, the casual, terrifying nonchalance of the man in the cashmere coat. She described how he had checked his watch, how he had complained about the cold, how he had lit a cigarette as if he were waiting for a bus rather than orchestrating the execution of a human being. It was the banality of the evil that chilled the room. There was no rage, no heat, no madness in the way the murder was carried out. It was a transaction, a logistics problem being solved in the dark. The witness had seen it all through the gaps in the floorboards of the guard shack, a tiny, terrified witness to a crime that had been written off as a tragic accident for a decade and a half. The information regarding the man in the cashmere coat was the pivot point of the entire case. The witness didn't just see his face. She knew his name. She had heard the enforcers address him. She had heard the tone of their voices, the mixture of fear and deference. She had seen the way the local police cruisers arrived afterward, not to secure the scene, but to coordinate the cleanup. It was a masterclass in systemic corruption. The murder of Marcus Vance hadn't been a botched kidnapping. It had been a surgical strike, a message sent by the new guard to the old, a demonstration of who truly owned the streets of Detroit. And now, the voice of the person who had watched the whole thing was recorded on a hard drive, a digital time bomb waiting to explode in the heart of the city's political elite. The task force knew that once this testimony went public, the fallout would be catastrophic. The Sterling family, the pillars of the community, the philanthropists, the architects of the city's resurgence, they were about to be revealed as the monsters under the floorboards. The logistics of keeping the witness safe became a nightmare. The Sterling family's influence was not limited to the police force. It permeated the judicial system, the private security firms, and even the local medical networks. Every time they had to move her, every time they had to transport her for medical care or legal counsel, it was a tactical operation involving multiple, redundant routes and counter-surveillance teams. They were playing a game of chess against an opponent who owned the board, the pieces, and the referees. Jenkins felt the noose tightening around her own career, knowing that if the Sterling family survived this, if the witness was compromised, or if the testimony was ruled inadmissible, she would be the first person they came for. But she was past the point of self-preservation. The ghost of Marcus Vance, and the shattered life of the woman sitting in that secure room, had eclipsed any concern for her own pension or position. The city outside the safe house continued its daily churn, unaware that the tectonic plates of its power structure were shifting. The podcast, Shadows of the Motor City, had gone silent, a deliberate choice by Liam Thorne to avoid drawing further attention to the investigation while the authorities worked, but the silence only fueled the rumors. In the dark corners of the internet, speculation raged. People were talking. They were putting the pieces together. The name Sterling began to appear in forums and on social media, whispered with a new, dangerous curiosity. The untouchable had become touchable. The legend of the dynasty was fraying at the edges, and for the first time in 16 years, the fear that had kept the city quiet was being replaced by a hungry, vengeful curiosity. It was a dangerous time to be a Sterling. The social veneer of the family was beginning to crack under the weight of the collective memory of the city. The witness, meanwhile, was undergoing a profound transformation. In the safety of the facility, she began to reclaim the person she had been before the Packard plant. She started to speak about her past, about the hopes and dreams she had held before she became a phantom. She talked about the art she used to make, the music she listened to, the simple, mundane joys of a normal life. It was a painful, agonizing process of unburying herself. Each memory was a shard of glass, cutting into the callus she had built around her heart. But it was necessary. To testify, she couldn't just be a witness. She had to be a person. She had to stand in front of a jury and be real. The detectives watched this metamorphosis with a sense of awe and sorrow. They were seeing someone walk out of a grave, blink in the sunlight, and realize that the world they had left behind was still there, waiting for them. The evidence gathering intensified. Using the witness's timeline, the task force launched a renewed forensic sweep of the East Side. They weren't looking for Marcus Vance anymore. They were looking for the footprint of the conspiracy. They looked for the hidden ledger books, the off-the-books construction projects, the discarded assets that had been scrubbed from the public record. They found connections, links between the Sterling real estate holdings and the private security companies that had been active in the area in 2010. They mapped the financial flows, tracing the money from the city's urban renewal funds to the accounts of the men who had been at the Packard plant that night. It was a web of graft and blood, a labyrinth of white-collar crime that had been built on the broken backs of the poor. The Sterling family hadn't just murdered a journalist. They had stolen the future of the city, and they had done it while smiling for the cameras at charity galas. The pressure on the Sterling family became palpable. Their public appearances became rarer, their demeanor more guarded. The arrogance that had fueled their climb to the top of the Detroit hierarchy was starting to look like desperation. They were accustomed to controlling the narrative, to buying their way out of problems, to rewriting history to suit their needs. But they had never dealt with a truth that couldn't be bought. They had never faced a witness who had nothing left to lose. The silence of the city, once their greatest asset, was now their greatest threat as it curdled into a collective, silent judgment. The Sterlings were discovering that history is not a static thing. It is a living entity, and it has a way of catching up to those who try to bury it. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation moved toward its inevitable, violent conclusion. The task force knew they couldn't hold the witness in the safe house forever. The defense attorneys would file motions, the media would demand answers, and the Sterling family would use every legal lever available to force the case into the open. They had to act. They had to synthesize the testimony, the forensic data, the financial records, and the digital footprint into an unassailable narrative. They were preparing to put the entire city of Detroit on trial, to force the citizenry to look at the blood-stained foundation of their own skyline. The case of Marcus Vance had become more than a cold case. It had become the definitive story of a city's struggle for its own soul, a battle between the truth and the powerful, between the forgotten and the entitled. And yet, in the heart of the storm, the witness remained the center of gravity. She was the one who had seen, the one who had remembered, the one who had survived. She was the vessel of the truth, and the burden of that truth was a heavy, dangerous thing. Every night, in the quiet of the safe house, she relived the moment in the Packard plant. She saw the flashlights, heard the crunch of snow, felt the paralyzing cold. She remembered the look on Marcus Vance's face when he realized he was going to die. She remembered the look on the man in the cashmere coat's face when he lit his cigarette. Those images were burned into her mind, indelible and permanent. She wasn't just a witness. She was a curator of a nightmare, and she was the only one who could finally, definitively end it. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when a retired police captain, guilt-ridden and dying of a terminal illness, reached out to the task force. He had been the one who had signed the order to clear the scene in 2010. He had been the one who had buried the report. He had spent the last 16 years living in a state of self-imposed exile, his life a slow, agonizing decay. He wanted to confess. He wanted the weight off his chest before he died. He provided the names, not just of the enforcers, but of the internal affairs officers who had been paid to look the other way. He gave them the dates, the times, the secret meetings. He provided the structure of the conspiracy, the map of the corruption that had turned the Detroit Police Department into the private security force of the Sterling family. With his statement, the case was complete. It wasn't just a murder case anymore. It was a RICO case, a systematic, institutional dismantling of a criminal empire. The task force sat in the command center, the silence heavy as they processed the magnitude of what they had built. They had moved from a whisper on a podcast to a massive, systemic indictment of the city's power structure. They had found the ghost, they had found the evidence, and they had found the collaborators. They were ready. The storm was coming, and there was no building in the city strong enough to withstand it. The Sterlings were about to learn that they weren't the kings of the castle. They were just the latest casualties of the truth. The investigation had been a long, dark, and winding road, but they had finally arrived at the precipice. And as they prepared to push the button, to unleash the truth, they knew that nothing in Detroit would ever be the same again. The cold case was closed. The Cold War was just beginning. Outside the facility, the wind whipped around the corners of the building, a stark reminder of the night that had started it all. The weather was a constant companion in the investigation, a sensory anchor to the 2010 blizzard that had tried to bury the secret forever. But the snow had melted, the winters had passed, and the ice was finally breaking. The city was waking up, the truth was surfacing, and the long, slow, agonizing crawl toward justice was accelerating into a sprint. The witness sat in her room, staring at the window, watching the moonlight play off the drifts of snow in the yard. She wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in 16 years, she felt a sense of anticipation. She was no longer a victim, and she was no longer a witness. She was the architect of their downfall. She was the catalyst of the city's salvation. And she was ready. The task force, tired and ragged, felt the change in the air. The final reports were being typed, the warrants were being drafted, and the strategy was being finalized. Every detail was accounted for, every contingency planned. They were no longer the underfunded, demoralized, and compromised unit they had been for so long. They were an elite, surgical team, and they were about to perform the most delicate and dangerous operation in the history of the Detroit Police Department. They were going to walk into the center of power and take it apart, piece by piece. They were going to do it for Marcus, they were going to do it for the city, and they were going to do it for the truth. The long, lonely nights, the years of ridicule, the dead ends, and the failures, they were all worth it for this moment. They were about to make history. But beneath the surface of their resolve, there was a lingering, gnawing doubt. They knew that the Sterling family would not go down without a fight. They knew that there were still loyalists in the department, that there were still judges who could be bought, that there were still people who would do anything to protect the status quo. They knew that the road ahead would be treacherous, filled with threats, bribes, and attempts to derail the process. They knew that the trial would be a circus, a media frenzy of unprecedented proportions. They knew that the city would be torn apart by the revelations. They knew that the road to justice was not a straight line, but a chaotic, unpredictable, and dangerous path. Yet, as they looked at the files spread out on the table, at the photos of the victim, at the statements of the witnesses, and at the mountain of evidence they had collected, they knew that they had no choice. They had started this. They had awakened the truth. And now they had to see it through to the end. The ghost of Marcus Vance was no longer a specter and machine. He was a mandate. He was the reason they existed. He was the reason they fought. And he was the reason they would win. The case was no longer just about the past. It was about the future. It was about the kind of city Detroit would be, the kind of justice it would serve, and the kind of truth it would tolerate. The night deepened, and the city of Detroit, the silent, watching giant, waited for the morning. It was a long wait, filled with the echoes of the past and the uncertainty of the future. The streets were quiet, the buildings were dark, and the river flowed silently toward the sea, carrying with it the secrets of 1,000 nights. But in the heart of the city, in the secret room where the truth was kept, the silence was beginning to fracture. The truth was leaking out drop by drop, and it was becoming a flood. It was an unstoppable force, a tide that would sweep away the lies and the secrets, the crimes and the criminals, the darkness and the fear. The witness closed her eyes, and for the first time in 16 years, she saw no Packard plant. She saw no man in a cashmere coat. She saw no snowy overpass. She saw a future. She saw life. She saw the possibility of a world where she could be herself, where she could breathe, where she could stand in the sun without looking over her shoulder. It was a fragile, distant vision, but it was there, and it was real. And as she drifted off to sleep, the first light of the dawn began to break over the horizon, painting the sky in colors of pale gray and defiant gold. The day was coming, the city was rising, and the truth was finally, inevitably, here. The detectives began the final briefing. They stood around the table, their faces set, their eyes focused. They were the thin blue line, the last defense, the agents of accountability. They weren't just cops anymore. They were the executioners of a long-delayed justice. They were the ones who would cross the threshold, the ones who would turn the key, and the ones who would open the door. They were the ones who would stand in the spotlight, and they were the ones who would walk away into the darkness, knowing that they had done their part. They were the ones who would be remembered, and they were the ones who would be forgotten. But for now, they were the ones who would change the world. And the world, in its infinite, indifferent way, continued to spin. The snow continued to fall, the river continued to flow, and the city continued to breathe. But the rhythm had changed. The cadence had shifted. The heartbeat of Detroit was no longer the same. Something had happened in the dark. Something had been brought to light, and the city was forever altered. The cold case was closed, but the case of the city was just beginning. And in the silence that followed, a silence that wasn't empty but pregnant with the weight of a million untold stories, the truth finally, quietly, began to speak. The final, frantic energy of the preparations for the raid began. There was no more time for hesitation, no more room for doubt. The team checked their weapons, their radios, their gear. They rehearsed the entry, the containment, the arrest. They went over the floor plans, the exit strategies, the medical protocols. They were precise, they were focused, and they were relentless. They were a machine, a well-oiled, efficient, and lethal machine of justice. They were the storm that was about to break over the heads of the Sterling dynasty, and they were the architects of their ruin. As they walked out the door, into the crisp, cold air of the morning, they felt the weight of the moment. They knew that when they returned, everything would be different. They knew that they would be the ones who had pulled the trigger on the end of an era. They knew that they would be the ones who had brought down the Titans, and they knew that they would be the ones who had cleaned up the mess. They looked at the horizon, at the skyline of the city they had spent their lives protecting, and they saw not just buildings, but history. They saw the ghosts of the past, the reality of the present, and the potential of the future. And they stepped forward, into the light, into the fight, and into the history. The cars rolled out, a silent, dark procession of vehicles moving through the early morning fog. They were the vanguard, the advance guard of the truth, and they were moving toward the seat of power. The city slept, unaware of the upheaval that was coming, unaware that the rules of the game had been changed, and unaware that the masters of their destiny were about to be stripped of their crowns. They were moving toward the end of the beginning and the beginning of the end. And in the heart of the procession, shielded by the armor of the state and the courage of the team, the witness watched the world pass by, waiting for the moment when she would finally, definitively, be free. The structural framework of Detroit's political elite began to fracture the moment Elena's formal, videotaped deposition was securely locked into the federal evidence database. Thomas Sterling wasn't just a politician. He was a foundational pillar of the city's modern establishment, a man whose family had controlled real estate, shipping lines, and local elections for 3 generations. In 2010, he had been a rising, charismatic councilman championing the highly publicized New Detroit Initiative. By 2026, he was a senior statesman, a kingmaker whose personal endorsement could make or break gubernatorial candidates, a beloved philanthropist whose name was deeply carved into the white marble walls of libraries, community centers, and hospitals across the entire state of Michigan. To accuse a man of his immense stature of a brutal, cold-blooded murder based on a 16-year-old cold case was a move that required flawless execution, absolute legal invincibility, and political nerves of steel. A single misstep, a solitary leaked document, or an incomplete forensic trail would result in the immediate, violent destruction of the prosecution and the permanent escape of a monster. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins and the federal prosecutors worked in total, agonizing isolation, bypassing the standard lines of communication within the local police departments to prevent any potential leaks from tipping off Sterling's vast, well-connected intelligence network. They knew that Sterling possessed an army of high-priced defense attorneys, private intelligence operatives, public relations crisis management firms, and deep, historical ties within the local judiciary that could effortlessly suppress a warrant if they saw it coming even an hour in advance. For 3 intensive, breathless weeks, the clandestine task force worked 18-hour days in a windowless room, meticulously verifying every single aspect of Elena's 2010 testimony against the historical, archived meteorological and cellular data logs of the Packard automotive plant vicinity. They uncovered old cellular tower metadata that placed Sterling's personal, unlisted mobile device in the exact, narrow sector of the east side at 2:14 a.m. on the night of the disappearance, a piece of damning data that had been deliberately, systematically omitted from the initial 2010 investigation report by a compromised technical unit technician who had received a massive promotion shortly after. The financial trail, long dead and buried beneath layers of corporate restructuring, bankruptcy filings, and shell company mergers, began to bleed fresh data when federal forensic accountants applied modern, highly sophisticated data mining algorithms to Sterling's historical campaign finance accounts. They discovered a massive, highly irregular cash withdrawal of $50,000 executed just 6 hours after Marcus Vance vanished from the overpass, a withdrawal masked as an emergency consulting fee paid to a defunct logistics firm owned by a notorious local enforcer named Iron Mike Kowalski. Kowalski had died in a violent prison stabbing in 2017, but his old, physical financial ledgers had been preserved in an unrelated federal racketeering file, holding the final, missing piece of the puzzle, a handwritten confirmation of a lucrative contract titled The Reporter Issue, signed with a unique, stylized monogram that belonged exclusively to Thomas Sterling. The evidence was no longer circumstantial, no longer just the word of an old whistleblower and an independent podcast. It was a devastating, interlocking web of forensic science, financial corruption, and eyewitness testimony that pointed directly to a state-sponsored, elite-ordered execution. The tactical plan for Sterling's arrest was executed with an aggressive, direct force that signaled to the entire city that the era of political immunity was officially, dramatically over. On a bright Thursday afternoon, as Sterling stood proudly on the stone steps of City Hall surrounded by news cameras, microphones, and cheering supporters, preparing to announce a massive new harbor redevelopment project, 3 black federal SUVs screeched to a halt at the curb. Before his private security detail could even react or assess the threat, a dozen armed federal agents swarmed the crowded plaza, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun, completely isolating the powerful politician from his stunned staff and the paralyzed members of the press. Lieutenant Jenkins stepped forward through the sea of flashing media cameras, her face grim and her voice echoing off the stone pillars of City Hall as she read Thomas Sterling his constitutional rights for the first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit the abduction of Marcus Vance. The expressions of absolute, paralyzed disbelief on the faces of the assembled city officials were captured live on midday television, a Chandong visual that instantly sent shockwaves across the entire nation. As the heavy steel handcuffs snapped shut around Sterling's wrists, the crowd that had gathered for the celebratory press conference erupted into a chaotic mixture of gasps, angry shouts, and stunned, breathless silence. The powerful tycoon, usually so calm, elegant, and completely in control of every room he entered, lost his composure for a split second, his jaw clenching and his face contorting into a mask of pure, vicious rage as he was forcefully, unceremoniously guided into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. The media instantly mobilized, their digital platforms exploding with breaking news banners and breathless live streams. Detroit 2010 Cold Case Solved podcast uncovers crucial hidden witness. The city was forced to confront the dark, terrifying reality that their grand economic renaissance had been funded, directed, and built by a man who carried the blood of a courageous journalist on his hands for 16 years, a man who had used his immense public stature, his charitable donations, and his political power as a shield against the ultimate sin. The vehicle carrying Sterling tore away from City Hall, leaving behind a wake of political destruction that would take years to clean up. In the back seat, the billionaire sat in a state of icy detachment, his eyes fixed forward, refusing to look at Lieutenant Jenkins or acknowledge the gravity of the cuffs binding his hands. He was a man who believed, with the absolute certainty of his bloodline, that this was merely a temporary inconvenience, a legal stunt engineered by his enemies that his legal army would dismantle by morning. But as the vehicle bypassed the local precinct and headed straight for the federal holding facility, a subtle shift occurred in his demeanor. The color began to drain from his face as he realized that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed. The shadow of the podcast, the public outcry, and the unyielding weight of the federal government had converged to strip away his armor, leaving him exposed to the one thing his family fortune could never buy: an honest, uncompromising trial. Back at the task force headquarters, the atmosphere was not one of celebration, but of intense, focused preparation for the legal war that was about to unleash. They knew that Sterling's arrest was just the opening salvo in a conflict that would test the integrity of the entire Michigan judicial system. The phones were already ringing off the hooks, with powerful figures from across the political spectrum demanding explanations, seeking assurances, and attempting to gauge how far the rod extended. Jenkins ignored them all, her eyes fixed on the massive corkboard that lined the wall, where the names of Sterling's co-conspirators, enforcers, and corrupt allies were pinned in a vast, complex web. They had the king, but the kingdom of corruption was still standing, and until every single piece of that machine was dismantled, the ghost of Marcus Vance would never truly rest, and the hidden witness who had sacrificed everything to bring the truth to light would never be truly safe. The immediate aftermath of Sterling's dramatic arrest triggered a massive, systemic purge within the administrative, judicial, and law enforcement institutions of Detroit as the sheer scale of his historical cover-up began to surface. Investigators uncovered an internal, highly classified file within the police archives that proved the initial 2010 investigation had been deliberately, systematically sabotaged from within by high-ranking officials who had received lucrative real estate kickbacks and off-the-books stock options from Sterling's development firms. Several retired precinct captains, former chief investigators, and county prosecutors suddenly found themselves facing federal grand jury subpoenas, their comfortable, wealthy retirements shattered by the realization that their complicity in Marcus Vance's murder was finally being dragged into the unyielding light of justice. The public's trust in the local justice system collapsed entirely, replaced by a fierce, righteous fury that demanded a total, uncompromising accounting of every single cold case file that had been buried during Sterling's multi-decade reign of political and economic influence. Inside the federal holding facility, Thomas Sterling's high-priced legal team launched an aggressive, immediate counteroffensive, filing a barrage of motions aimed at disqualifying Elena's testimony and painting the entire prosecution as a politically motivated hit job fueled by podcast gossip and digital sensationalism. They argued that Elena was an unreliable witness with a history of housing instability and mental health trauma, whose memories had been corrupted by 16 years of isolation and the highly biased narrative propagated by Shadows of the Motor City. They demanded that their client be released on a signature bond, arguing that an elite public figure of Sterling's immense stature and deep roots in the community posed absolutely no flight risk and deserved to await trial in his multi-million-dollar mansion in Grosse Pointe. But the federal judge, recognizing the extreme gravity of the charges and the horrifying historical patterns of intimidation exposed by the newly recovered financial records, flatly denied bail, ordering Sterling to remain incarcerated in a high-security cell until the commencement of the trial. Meanwhile, Liam Thorne, the podcaster whose independent investigation had broken the decades-old deadlock, found himself at the center of an international media storm, praised as a pioneer of modern digital journalism while simultaneously facing intense, implicit threats from the remnants of Sterling's criminal network. He released a special, live broadcast episode of Shadows of the Motor City, dedicating the historic moment not to his own success, but to the memory of Marcus Vance and the incredible, survivalist courage of Elena. Thorne revealed that since the arrest, his team had been flooded with hundreds of new tips from former city employees, construction contractors, and low-level street operators who were suddenly willing to speak out, now that the terrifying shadow of Sterling's immunity had been permanently lifted from the city. The podcast had transformed from a simple true crime retrospective into a living, breathing instrument of social justice, an audio platform that had successfully challenged the most powerful dynasty in Michigan and won. The physical search for Marcus Vance's remains became the next, deeply emotional focal point of the task force's efforts, as Elena's testimony provided specific coordinates that led search teams back to the industrial wasteland where the abduction had occurred. For 16 years, Marcus's body had been hidden in a location so ordinary, so completely integrated into the urban decay of the East Side, that thousands of people had walked past it daily without ever realizing they were standing on a grave. Utilizing ground-penetrating radar, specialized canine units, and heavy excavation equipment, forensic teams descended upon an old, sealed concrete vault beneath the foundation of a Sterling-owned warehouse near the riverfront. The entire area was cordoned off from the press, the silence of the industrial zone broken only by the rhythmic, heavy thud of jackhammers tearing through layers of reinforced stone that had been poured just days after the 2010 blizzard. On the third day of the intense excavation, deep within the dark, damp recesses of the subterranean vault, the search teams finally located what they were looking for: a heavy, industrial steel drum, completely encased in commercial-grade resin. When the forensic anthropologists carefully breached the structure, they discovered the remarkably preserved remains of Marcus Vance, still clutching a small, digital voice recorder in his skeletal hand, a final, defiant act of journalistic courage from a man who knew he was about to be murdered. The recorder, remarkably shielded from moisture and decay by the resin casing, was rushed directly to a specialized federal cyberforensics lab in Washington, where technicians began the delicate, high-stakes process of extracting the data from the ancient memory chip. The dead man was about to speak from beyond the grave, and his final words would provide the ultimate, absolute validation of the truth that Elena had carried in silence for 16 agonizing years. As the news of the body's recovery spread across the city, an impromptu candlelit vigil formed outside the perimeter of the excavation site. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had been teenagers when Marcus disappeared, stood shoulder to shoulder in the biting evening air, holding up photographs of the young reporter. The grim warehouse district, once a symbol of fear and forgotten crimes, became a sanctuary of collective grief and historic vindication. Marcus's family, who had spent nearly 2 decades trapped in the agonizing limbo of the unknown, released a brief statement expressing their profound gratitude to the anonymous tipsters, the cold case unit, and the millions of listeners who refused to let his memory die. The narrative was no longer controlled by City Hall or the high-priced public relations firms. It belonged to the people of Detroit, who were finally seeing the first real signs of a systemic cleansing that was 52 years in the making. Behind the scenes, the legal battle over the recovered voice recorder intensified into a furious war of injunctions and appeals. Sterling's defense team argued that any data recovered from the device was fruit of a poisonous tree, stemming from an unconstitutional search of property that had changed corporate ownership multiple times since 2010. They fought desperately to block the audio from being introduced to the grand jury, knowing that if Marcus's final moments were played in open court, no amount of legal maneuvering could save their client from a life sentence. But federal prosecutors countered with absolute precision, establishing an unbroken chain of custody from the moment the steel drum was breached to the laboratory cleanroom. They argued that the device represented the dying declaration of a victim of an ongoing criminal conspiracy, an unsilenceable voice that had a constitutional right to be heard by the pillars of justice. The successful extraction of the audio data from Marcus Vance's recovered voice recorder provided the federal prosecution with an ironclad, indisputable piece of evidence that effectively sealed Thomas Sterling's judicial fate before the trial even commenced. Inside the heavily fortified cleanrooms of the Federal Cyberforensics Laboratory in Washington, technicians had spent 72 continuous hours stabilizing the ancient, degraded flash memory chip. They bypassed corrupted sectors and eliminated ambient static using advanced neural audio filtering, working with the delicate precision of surgeons operating on a living heart. When the digital audio file was finally converted into a pristine, uncompressed playback stream, the resulting sound was so terrifyingly clear, so completely devastating in its content, that it sent an immediate wave of grim silence through the entire Department of Justice leadership team. The audio file, recorded in the terrifying final moments inside the suffocating trunk of the moving SUV on December 14, 2010, captured the raw, ambient sounds of the blizzard outside, the heavy, metallic rattling of the chassis, and the shallow, frantic breathing of the captive journalist. Marcus Vance, knowing with absolute certainty that he was being driven to his execution, had managed to secretly activate the pocket-sized device, holding it tightly against his chest to muffle the clicking mechanism from his captors. For the first 12 minutes, the recording was a chaotic symphony of violence, the muffled thud of heavy boots, the low, mechanical hum of the heater, and the cold, transactional dialogue of Sterling's hired enforcers discussing the logistics of the excavation site. But the true, community-shattering climax of the recording occurred at exactly the 14-minute mark, when the vehicle finally ground to a halt inside the dark, hollow echo of the waterfront warehouse. The heavy trunk lid slammed open with a violent screech of rusted hinges, letting in the fierce, howling sound of the Detroit winter wind. The enforcers dragged Marcus out onto the freezing concrete, his heavy breathing turning into a series of desperate, agonizing coughs as his face slammed against the floor. Then, the rhythmic, unmistakable crunch of expensive leather shoes on loose gravel signaled the arrival of a third individual. In a moment of chilling clarity that left the federal grand jury in absolute, paralyzed silence during its secret reading, Thomas Sterling's voice cut through the ambient darkness of the recording like a razor blade. The charismatic politician, usually so polished, elegant, and soft-spoken in front of the television cameras, spoke with a cold, terrifying nonchalance that stripped away his entire public persona in a matter of seconds. "You should have taken the corporate board seat when my father offered it to you, Marcus." Sterling's voice resonated from the speakers, completely devoid of rage or hesitation, carrying the flat, methodical tone of a businessman concluding a minor real estate transaction. "You thought you were saving the city, but you're just an administrative error that needs to be permanently corrected before the morning news cycle." Marcus Vance's voice, raw with pain but remarkably defiant, responded through the darkness, calling the councilman by his true name, warning him that the truth could never be buried under a layer of industrial concrete. But Sterling merely chuckled a low, dismissive sound that was followed by the distinct, metallic flick of a luxury lighter as he casually lit a cigarette in the freezing air. He could be heard explicitly instructing his enforcers to make sure the body is encased in the industrial resin and poured deep under the warehouse foundation before the city crews start clearing the snow from the roads at dawn. The arrogance of the powerful politician was laid bare for the world to hear, his own spoken words transforming into the definitive legal instrument that would dismantle his legacy, destroy his family's multi-generational empire, and send him to a high-security prison cell for the rest of his natural life. The defense team's elaborate, multi-million-dollar strategies, which had spent months trying to frame the entire investigation as a modern witch hunt fueled by independent podcast gossip and unreliable witness memories, completely collapsed under the sheer, crushing weight of the audio evidence. Federal prosecutors immediately filed a supplemental motion to introduce the voice recording as a core piece of the government's case-in-chief, rendering any further legal maneuvers or public relations counteroffensives completely useless. The dead man was finally speaking from beyond the grave, and his voice was an absolute, unstoppable force that no amount of money or political influence could ever silence. As news of the audio recording's contents leaked into the mainstream media, a profound, righteous fury swept through the neighborhoods of Detroit, transforming the initial shock of the arrest into a widespread cultural reckoning. Citizens realized that the grand architectural projects, the luxury waterfront developments, and the elite political galas they had witnessed over the last 16 years had been staged by a man who carried the literal echoes of an execution in his past. Activists gathered outside the secured perimeter of the corporate headquarters of Sterling Enterprises, demanding the immediate removal of the family name from all public universities, municipal plazas, and charitable foundations across the state of Michigan. The city was undergoing a massive, painful catharsis, tearing down the false idols of its supposed renaissance to expose the blood-stained foundation upon which it had been constructed, proving that a true community cannot heal until its oldest, coldest wounds are finally brought into the light of unyielding justice. The formal indictment of Thomas Sterling changed the atmospheric pressure inside the Eastern District of Michigan, morphing the federal courthouse into a high-security citadel where the rules of old money diplomacy no longer applied. The defense team, realizing that the recovered audio file was an existential threat to their client's survival, deployed a scorched-earth legal campaign designed to delay the trial until the political landscape could shift in their favor. They filed over 40 separate motions in rapid succession, challenging everything from the psychological competency of Elena to the specific calibration of the neural audio filtering software used by the federal laboratory in Washington. They claimed that the voice on the recording was a digital forgery, a highly sophisticated deepfake manufactured by political enemies and amplified by an unregulated, sensationalist true crime podcast to destroy a lifetime of public service. But federal prosecutors, led by a relentless assistant district attorney named David Vance, no relation to the victim, but a man driven by a similar obsession with structural justice, countered every motion with a mountain of corroborating data. They introduced expert testimony from the world's leading acoustic forensic scientists who proved that the unique vocal frequencies, the micropauses in speech, and even the ambient reverb of the warehouse architecture matched Sterling's biometrics with a probability rating that left no room for rational doubt. The prosecution also finalized a secret, ironclad immunity agreement with the retired tech unit technician who had omitted the cellular tower metadata in 2010. Facing a potential 20-year sentence for accessory after the fact, the former technician broke down in a tearful deposition, admitting that Sterling's personal security chief had delivered a duffel bag containing $100,000 in cash to his home just 48 hours after the murder. The wall of protection that had shielded Thomas Sterling for 16 years was not just cracking, it was experiencing a total, catastrophic structural failure as the lower-level cogs in his machine began to realize that the billionaire could no longer protect them from the federal government. Low-level contractors who had poured the reinforced concrete foundation over the steel drum in 2010 began coming forward to the task force, begging for deals to avoid conspiracy charges, their collective testimonies providing a detailed, day-by-day account of how the corporate entities of Sterling Enterprises had been utilized to erase the physical footprint of a homicide. The financial records of these shell companies, once viewed as an impenetrable labyrinth of white-collar genius, were now revealed to be nothing more than a digital paper trail documenting the logistics of a state-sanctioned execution. As the summer of 2026 approached, the psychological transformation of the city became absolute, marked by a profound, collective refusal to let the Sterling dynasty control the narrative any longer. The Board of Trustees at Wayne State University voted unanimously to strip the Sterling name from its law school building, while city workers were dispatched in the dead of night to remove his portrait from the Gallery of Honor inside City Hall. The public was no longer paralyzed by the fear that had characterized the early years of the cold case. The podcast had given them a vocabulary to discuss the corruption, and the forensic evidence had given them the confidence to demand absolute, uncompromising ruin for those who had perverted the law. The upcoming trial was no longer viewed as a mere criminal proceeding. It was an historic tribunal for the soul of Detroit, a definitive test of whether a working-class community could hold its most powerful elite to the same unyielding standard of human justice. Inside his isolated cell at the Federal Detention Center, stripped of his custom-tailored suits, his silk ties, and his legions of obsequious corporate assistants, Thomas Sterling began to resemble the very ghosts he had tried to bury beneath the concrete. His hair grew long and unkempt, his face hollowed out by the harsh, institutional diet, and his eyes, which had once flashed with the arrogant certainty of an untouchable king, were now fixed in a permanent, haunted stare directed at the steel door of his cell. Yet, despite the physical decline, his defense attorneys maintained an aggressive public posture, holding daily press conferences on the courthouse steps where they accused the government of running a modern star chamber fueled by internet hysteria and media-driven vengeance. They were playing a dangerous, high-stakes game of public relations, attempting to poison the jury pool before a single citizen could be seated in the box, confident that if they could create just a single sliver of reasonable doubt, the billionaire's empire could still survive the storm. But the machinery of federal justice is an unyielding, unemotional entity that moves with its own gravity, entirely indifferent to the theatrical displays of high-priced defense lawyers or the shifting winds of public opinion. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins spent her final nights before the trial review sessions sitting in the quiet of her home, looking at the two photographs pinned to her desk, one of 19-year-old Marcus Vance smiling into a news camera in 2010, and one of Elena, the hidden witness who had survived 16 years in the dark to deliver the truth. Jenkins knew that the legal battle ahead would be a vicious, exhausting gauntlet, a war of attrition where every word spoken on the stand would be dissected by some of the sharpest legal minds in the country. But as she watched the morning sun rise over the Detroit River, painting the city's skyline in shades of defiant gold, she felt an unshakable, profound sense of peace. The secret was out, the ghost had spoken, and the long, agonizing winter of 2010 was finally coming to an end. The selection of the jury for the trial of the United States versus Thomas Sterling was an exercise in mapping the psychological scars of a modern American city. For 3 grueling weeks inside the high-ceilinged ceremonial courtroom of the Theodore Levin United States Courthouse, hundreds of Detroit citizens were called forward, questioned, and methodically scrutinized. The defense sought to weed out anyone who had listened to a single second of Shadows of the Motor City, launching fierce objections every time a potential juror admitted that the viral true crime podcast had popped up on their digital feeds. They wanted a jury of statistical impossibilities, 12 people completely blind to the tectonic political shift occurring right outside their windows. The prosecution, conversely, looked for analytical minds, individuals who could look past the glamorous history of the Sterling dynasty and focus entirely on the unyielding, mathematical precision of modern forensic science. When the final 12 were eventually sworn in, a heavy, historical silence descended upon the chamber. The stage was officially set for a legal battle that would permanently redefine the boundaries of power and privilege in the state of Michigan. The opening statements commenced on a sweltering July morning, the intense heat outside mirroring the suffocating tension within the packed gallery. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Vance stood before the jury box, his demeanor calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of theatrical exaggeration. He did not begin with a loud rhetorical flourish. Instead, he walked over to the evidence presentation screen and displayed a single, high-resolution photograph of 19-year-old Marcus Vance taken just weeks before his disappearance. The young journalist's eyes looked out into the courtroom with an intense, fearless curiosity, a stark contrast to the hollow, clinical images that followed, the frozen overpass, the shattered voice recording equipment, and the heavy, rusted steel drum hauled from the depths of the concrete vault. Vance's voice was a steady, rhythmic instrument as he laid out the government's narrative, painting a devastating portrait of a cold-blooded execution ordered not by a desperate street criminal, but by a calculating politician who viewed a human life as nothing more than a disposable line item in a real estate development strategy. This is not a case about ancient history or forgotten mistakes, the prosecutor stated, his eyes locking with each juror in turn. This is a case about a man who believed that if you have enough money, enough political influence, and enough institutional control, you can rewrite reality itself. Thomas Sterling did not just murder a courageous young reporter on December 14, 2010. He murdered the very idea that justice applies equally to all of us. For 16 years, He built an empire on top of a hidden grave, confident that the ice would never melt, that the concrete would never crack, and that the voices of the dead could be permanently muffled by a multi-million-dollar philanthropic facade. But science does not forget. Truth does not dissolve in industrial resin. And today, gentlemen of the jury, the past has finally arrived to collect its debt. When the defense team took the podium, led by a legendary, white-haired corporate litigator named Philip Kensington, the strategy shifted into an aggressive display of systematic misdirection and character assassination. Kensington did not attempt to defend the moral character of the underworld enforcers or the corrupt police officials whose text messages and financial ledgers had been exposed by the task force. Instead, he focused his entire legal arsenal on the integrity of the evidence itself, attempting to frame the prosecution's case as a fragile castle of cards built on compromised data and digital manipulation. He paced back and forth before the jury box, his voice booming with a theatrical, righteous indignation as he pointed a trembling finger at the defense table, where Thomas Sterling sat dressed in a pristine, dark charcoal suit, his face an immovable, aristocratic mask of injured innocence. What you are witnessing in this courtroom is not a pursuit of justice. It is a public execution by media sensation, Kensington declared, his voice dripping with calculated contempt. The government has spent millions of tax dollar resources to validate the wild, uncorroborated theories of an unregulated internet broadcaster who sells advertisements against human tragedy. They have dragged an honorable public servant, a man whose family has spent 3 generations building the schools, the hospitals, and the economic engines of the city, into a cage based on the highly corrupted memories of a transient witness and a degraded piece of plastic that sat in a damp warehouse for a decade and a half. They want you to convict a living legend based on a voice recording that has been sliced, diced, and digitally altered by government technicians until it fits their narrative. We will show you that there is not a single shred of untainted, reliable evidence linking Thomas Sterling to this horrific crime, and we will demand that you return this innocent man to the community he has served so faithfully. The prosecution spent the next 5 days calling their technical witnesses to the stand, systematically building an unassailable mountain of forensic data that left the defense team's theories visibly fraying at the edges. Acoustic forensic scientists from the federal laboratory took the jury deep into the mathematics of voice analysis, demonstrating how Sterling's unique vocal tract length, nasal resonance frequencies, and subconscious speech patterns were completely identical to the voice captured on Marcus Vance's recovered recorder. They displayed massive, color-coded spectrograms on the screen, showing the jury how the microscopic physical anomalies of the digital file proved it was an original, uninterrupted recording, entirely free of modern editing artifacts, deepfake splices, or algorithmic generation. With each expert witness, the technical reality of the crime became more absolute, transforming the abstract tragedy of 2010 into a concrete, undeniable truth that filled the courtroom with a chilling, clinical finality. The tension within the courthouse reached an absolute peak on the second Monday of the trial, the day the prosecution announced they were calling their star witness, Elena, the hidden observer who had spent 16 years running from the ghosts of the Packard automotive plant. The gallery held its collective breath as the heavy wooden doors opened, and Elena walked down the center aisle, flanked by 4 armed federal marshals. She moved with a quiet, fierce dignity, her eyes fixed entirely on the witness stand, refusing to look at the media cameras or the intense, predatory glare of Thomas Sterling, who leaned forward at the defense table, his hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists for the first time since the trial began. As Elena took the oath and stepped onto the dais, the silence in the room was so profound that the rhythmic, electronic clicking of the court stenographer's machine sounded like a ticking clock in an empty room, counting down the final, definitive moments of a multi-decade lie. The witness stand inside the federal courtroom became an island of absolute truth the moment Elena settled into the wooden chair and adjusted the microphone, her face framed by the harsh, utilitarian glare of the institutional lighting. She looked remarkably calm, her posture projecting a quiet, resilient dignity that had been forged in the crucible of a 16-year exile, her eyes clear and unblinking as she faced the 12 ordinary citizens who held the destiny of the city in their hands. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Vance walked over to the podium with a slow, respectful cadence, his voice lowering to a gentle, encouraging tone as he began the direct examination, guiding the star witness back through the dark corridors of her own memory to the freezing, snow-choked night of December 14, 2010. The gallery sat in a state of suspended animation, every reporter, spectator, and court officer leaning forward to capture every syllable that escaped into the silent, suffocating air of the room. Elena spoke with a crystalline, unwavering clarity, her words painting a visceral, terrifying picture of what it felt like to be a homeless 16-year-old teenager trapped inside the crumbling ruin of the Packard automotive plant during a record-breaking blizzard. She described the skeletal geometry of the old concrete pillars, the way the freezing wind howled through the shattered window frames like a dying animal, and the sudden, jarring intrusion of a modern vehicle's headlights cutting through the swirling wall of white snow. She took the jury step by step through the mechanics of the ambush, describing how the dark SUV had violently boxed in Marcus Vance's sedan on the isolated overpass, and how the two large enforcers had dragged the screaming journalist onto the slush-covered asphalt with a terrifying, practiced precision. But the emotional axis of the entire trial shifted permanently when the prosecutor asked her to describe the third man who stepped out of the vehicle, the man who stood calmly under the flickering amber streetlights, entirely unbothered by the violence taking place at his feet. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like someone who belonged on a billboard, Elena stated, her voice echoing off the stone walls of the courtroom with a chilling, clinical finality. She turned her head slowly, her gaze cutting through the space until it locked onto the defense table, pointing a single, steady finger directly at the billionaire defendant. It was him, Thomas Sterling. He was wearing a long, expensive cashmere coat that looked like it cost more than everything my family had ever owned. He didn't participate in the beating. He just stood there with his hands in his pockets, watching Marcus struggle in the snow as if he were supervising a standard construction crew. When Marcus screamed his name and begged him to think about his family, Sterling didn't flinch. He walked over, leaned down until he was inches from his face, and said something I couldn't hear over the wind, before casually flicking a cigarette into the snow and ordering his men to throw the body into the trunk. I will never forget that face as long as I live. It has been chasing me through my nightmares for 16 years. The reaction at the defense table was instantaneous and volatile, breaking the carefully managed, aristocratic facade that Thomas Sterling had maintained since the morning of his arrest. The billionaire's face contorted into a pale mask of pure, unadulterated venom, his eyes flashing with a predatory rage as he slammed his fist onto the polished wood of the table, half rising from his chair to shout a desperate, furious denial before being forcefully pulled back down by his senior defense counsel. The judge slammed her gavel with an explosive, rhythmic violence that restored immediate order to the room, warning the defendant that any further outbursts would result in his immediate removal to a holding cell below. The jury watched this dramatic display with a collective, unblinking intensity, noting the stark contrast between Elena's calm, immovable conviction and the violent, unraveling composure of the man who had ruled the city for a generation. When Philip Kensington took the podium for the cross-examination, he unleashed a fierce, scorched-earth interrogation designed to break Elena's psychological resolve and expose her to the jury as an unstable, highly unreliable narrator. He paced back and forth before the witness stand like a wolf circling its prey, his voice booming with a theatrical, aggressive skepticism as he questioned her history of transient living, her psychological evaluations from her time in the juvenile system, and the specific mechanics of her vision through a grime-covered window in the middle of a blinding blizzard. He demanded to know how a terrified, freezing teenager could differentiate between an expensive cashmere coat and a standard wool jacket from 20 yards away in the dark, suggesting that her entire memory had been artificially synthesized over the last 16 years by reading newspaper articles and listening to the sensationalized theories of Liam Thorne's podcast. Isn't it true, Ms. Miller, that you never actually saw the face of the man on that overpass? Kensington shouted, stepping deep into her personal space, his finger pointing aggressively at her face. Isn't it true that you were so consumed by terror, so disoriented by the freezing cold, that you simply mapped the face of a famous, wealthy politician onto a faceless shadow because it made your story more valuable to a true crime broadcaster who wanted to make $1 million from a tragic cold case? You expect this jury to destroy the life of an American icon based on a fleeting glimpse through a cracked window during the worst blizzard in modern Detroit history. But Elena did not break, did not flinch, and did not lower her head under the weight of the corporate litigator's assault. She merely stared back at him with a cold, unyielding pity that seemed to drain the power from his theatrical performance. She leaned into the microphone, her voice dropping to a low, quiet register that forced everyone in the room to hold their breath to hear it. The blizzard was blinding, Mr. Kensington, but the streetlights on that overpass were sodium vapor lamps. They cast a bright, orange glow that cut straight through the snow. When Thomas Sterling lit his cigarette, the flame illuminated his face from 6 inches away, reflecting in his eyes as he looked down at a dying man. You can call me crazy, you can call me a liar, and you can talk about my past all you want, but you cannot change the fact that I know what I saw. I saw your client murder a man, and I spent 16 years running for my life because of it. I'm not running anymore. The cross-examination concluded not with a triumphant breakthrough for the defense, but with a silent, devastating realization that they had failed to shake the foundational truth of the government's star witness. As Elena stepped down from the stand and walked out of the courtroom, once again protected by her detail of federal marshals, the atmosphere in the room felt entirely different. The legal theories, the procedural objections, and the corporate misdirection had been completely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but the raw, unvarnished human reality of a cold-blooded execution. The prosecution officially rested its case in chief, leaving the defense team with a monumental, near-impossible task of trying to construct an alternate reality that could survive the crushing weight of an eyewitness who had walked out of the dark to claim her justice.